Welcome everybody. Now, here we have a different view of the property, looking at the back of the house from the backyard. And from here you can see that it's built up on a hill. And I told you in the very first video that this was former farmland. And you don't generally see hills in the middle of fields on farms. It's not convenient to move your tractor and your heavy equipment along on an angle to plow and plant and combine. So, you generally have it relatively flat. But when we bought this lot and decided to build our house here, we moved a lot of dirt around to build up that hill from other places on the property. Contoured it up, made that hill. You can also see that the siding on the house, the light gray stuff, ends quite a ways before it actually hits the ground. There's that black it's like asphalt shingle material, so to keep the water off the wood below that. And you can see the deck, it's sort of the same thing, it's up high. And those are, those things, the bottom of the siding and the deck are basically level with the floor in the house, maybe even a little bit lower, just to make room for the threshold for the door. We'll step out, so just a little bit lower. And everything below that, where that black stuff is, and below, is the crawl space. And that actually even extends at least a good 3 feet more underneath the ground. And it's not much of a crawl space, to be honest, because of that. It's it's a good 5+ feet tall, so it's more of a stoop over and wander around space, which is good, because we had an actual crawl space in the last place that we lived in California, and it was a real crawl space. It was, at best, you were on your elbows and knees, and at worst, you were laying on your belly and slithering like a snake to get through it. So, this is a lot easier to work in. So it's, better design, I'd say. But, you might ask, why is it up so high? And that's actually a very good question, and it does relate to what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to stick a pin in that, and we're going to get back to it. So what we are going to talk about today is going to start with how you get rid of your wastewater, the water that you have used in various ways in your house, whatever goes down the drain, down the toilet, whatever. Now, in both city and in a rural area, it starts out the same. It all goes into a wastewater line, one big pipe, sends it all out. But from there, where it goes from there is where the difference is. It's quite different from a city to a rural area like this. In a city, it would connect to a sewer system. Generally a big pipe in the middle of your street, out in front of your house. And all of your waste would go in there. It's mainly for the solid waste. There's food waste and soap residue and things like that, and those aren't great. Soap can have some chemicals in it that can be pretty bad for the environment in general, but mainly it's about your solid waste. It's about your poop. There's a lot of stuff in your poop that is quite bad. There's a lot of bacteria in your gut, in your intestines and such, that are very helpful in there for digesting your food, but if they get anywhere else inside you, they can be quite harmful. And chief among these is E. coli. Now, not every strain of E. coli is actually all that harmful to you if you get it elsewhere, but there's a few that are, and they're pretty bad. They make people quite sick. People die from it. It's not good. It needs to be dealt with, and so they do. And in a sewer system, they deal with it by, it moves down with the water to a sewage treatment plant eventually. And they use chemicals to kill off all the harmful bacteria in there. You also, viruses in your body can go out through your intestines and out in your poop. They were tracking COVID that way early on. They could figure out whether there was an outbreak in an area, at least by the amount of it, the concentration of it in the solid waste in the sewer systems. So, just any other virus too. It all goes through you, and some of it ends up in your digestive tract. It just, it's part of the process of getting rid of it. And the sewer system, it works pretty well. It's as long as you don't have catastrophes happening, flooding or great big power outages or something like that, and then sometimes untreated raw sewage will get out and end up in wherever it usually goes, someplace like the ocean or a lake or a river, and then that it just means that the beach where that is contaminated, or the riverfront or the lakefront, and they just have to keep testing it until it gets down to reasonable levels again, and then people can go back. It's it's not perfect, nothing is. Could build more redundancy into it, I suppose, but it doesn't happen all that often, but it does happen. So yeah, that's what happens in the city. That's how your wastewater goes away, and that's kind of tied in to what I was talking about in the last video about municipal water. The two things go together. If you have one, you have the other, but it's not always simultaneous. The water mains to get the water to the places go in first. They have to go in before the buildings are done, because you have to be able to connect to water. Otherwise people aren't going to buy or move into those buildings. So you have to get that done right away. But the sewer lines, like when the suburban explosion from the late 40s into the modern day, but mostly late 40s through about the 70s or so, when that was happening, a lot of these places were getting built pretty fast, and they didn't get their sewer lines until a bit later. And you gotta wonder what was happening to their wastewater. Well, what was happening to their wastewater is a lot like what happens here in a rural place, at least for a brief period of time, until they caught up and got the sewer lines in. See, the sewer lines they could put in without disturbing the homes. The main sewer line itself goes in the street. You could dig a very small trench to extend the wastewater line from each house to that sewer line. That was all you had to do. It wasn't too much disruption, so they would often just wait. And what they had there is like what we have here, and that is a septic system. Now let's talk about the septic system. Right over there at the septic system. So here we are at the beginning of the septic system. This is the septic tank. Now, people who grew up in the city even probably at least know of a septic tank, might have some concept of what they're like, what they do. But just to go over it here, septic tank is a cement box you bury in the ground, and it has a couple lids on the top of it to pump it out, because it receives all of your waste, including all of your solid waste, and that will just continue to fill up, and eventually, years, decades, whatever later, you will probably have to get it pumped out at some point. And so it has two lids. You take them both off, put a hose down one to suck it out, and the other one is just open for carburation to allow the suction to work better. And that's how it works. Now, the wastewater line from the house goes into one end of it, the hole, and everything that comes out from your drains and your toilets and such goes right into that tank. And the solid waste, at least in theory, should fall down to the bottom, and the liquid water and whatever else waste in there, all the food residue, all your soap residue, things like that, grease, it would all sort of stay on the top and float. Now, it can't just keep filling up, because eventually it would get up over the wastewater line and it would start backing up into that, and then you'd have septic liquid coming up into your drains. and you don't want that. That'd be awful. So on the other end of it, there's another hole, and from that hole goes another pipe. That pipe leads out to the second part of your septic system. And this is the part that you wouldn't know about growing up in the suburbs. I never heard of it before I moved here, before we had to put one in. And that is a septic capture field. That pipe goes out, and it joins up to a union, a hole on one side for that pipe, and it splits out into like 4 runs, 4 more holes, where another pipe goes into each one of those holes. It's capped at the far end, and that pipe is like a wiffle ball. It has holes drilled in it periodically, all the way along it, and in several places around the circumference of the pipe itself. And you pack around those pipes with septic grade sand, which is sand that is rated for high absorbency of water. Then you put dirt over top of it and hopefully try and get grass to grow. That was no mean feat. We'll get back to that in a moment. But yeah, the idea behind that is that while your solid waste has fallen to the bottom, that's like the worst of the stuff that goes into your septic tank, it is still intermingling with that water. You know, little bits and pieces of it break off and float away into the water, including bacteria and viruses and things like that. And you don't want those just go out onto your lawn, out in the open. There's barely any point of having a septic tank if you're doing that. Just having it slowly seep out in there. It would just be fodder for the deer and rabbits and birds and everything else that ate the grass. And they'd all get sick, and you'd have a big old outbreak of E. coli poisoning or something like that. And that'd be pretty terrible. So you don't do that. The liquid that has all those particles and bits of bacteria and virus and such in them gets trapped in that septic grade sand. And that stuff, bacteria and viruses and things, they don't live outside of a host forever. E. coli dies within a few days outside of the host body. So the idea is it just gets trapped in that sand and it dies off. That neutralizes it. Sort of like what the chemicals in a sewage treatment plant do. But it's all self-contained right here on my property. Because it has to be. You've got to get rid of it, but you're not going to, there's not an infrastructure to move it away, so you've got to do it yourself. It's the same with the well. The well mimics the functions of a municipal water system, but it's all self-contained on your own property. Same deal. That's kind of like a theme out here in rural America, is that a lot of your stuff has to be self-sufficient. You have to deal with it yourself on your property. So that's what we do. Now, I mentioned that it's hard to grow the grass on there. See, that sand, the septic grade sand, is really good at absorbing water. It does its job very well. But it's not smart. It's just sand. It doesn't know the difference between the water coming out of those pipes and the water coming from the soil above it, which is supposed to sustain the grass that grows in it or whatever else is in there. And so it just sucks it all up. So this field behind me, this septic field, is kind of the canary in the coal mine for drought conditions. It will start going brown right away. And so I have to water it. So I have a sprinkler over here. And you don't see these very often out here. Nobody really waters their lawn too much, even when it's really dry. You should probably just let most of it die. You might water a small chunk in the front just to keep up appearances, but you don't see these sprinklers very much. We can't do sprinkler systems like they do in Los Angeles, in-ground sprinklers, because our ground freezes. And one thing you may not know about ground when it freezes is that it heaves up. It moves around. It does all kinds of weird things. If you have open dirt, like a garden or a flower bed, and it is completely clear of stones and such in the fall, by spring, there's a good likelihood that once the snow melts, you'll find a bunch of new stones in there, and they just got heaved up out of the ground. They just got pushed up by all the motion of the ground as it froze. It's the same reason that in places where it freezes, they have to resurface roads a lot more, because it heaves up, the dirt underneath the roads even heaves up, and it pushes up the asphalt, and it'll crack it, and then, even more water can get in and freeze up and push it apart even more. And, then when the ground thaws out in spring, it just collapses back down, and it'll crack more, and sometimes the dirt will have washed out underneath it, and then it'll collapse into that and make a pothole, and it's just a nightmare. And so we have to resurface roads a lot more than they do in Southern California. And, if you do that, if you had sprinklers in the ground here, even if you buried them deep below the frost line, below the point where the ground freezes, because it doesn't freeze all the way down to the core of the earth or anything like that. It only goes down about maybe 18 inches or something like that at the worst. So if you ran them underneath, you'd still have the sprinkler heads and the pipes connected to them coming up to the top, and they'd be in the frozen part, and they'd get pushed around and stuff, and they'd snap off. So you just can't do that. And the other option is sprinklers like this, but on 4 acres of lawn, that would be way too much to water with these things. You need 20 different spigots to connect hoses to connect these things to, and you'd still be moving around all the time to try and keep it watered, so nobody does. Except, for me in this one little section, because it was such a bother. Because the very same thing that makes it go dry quickly made it a real bother to get it to grow grass in the first place. We tried once seeding it, and all we got was weeds. We tried again, and basically all we got was weeds again. And so we put more dirt on top of it, so that's kind of mounded it up, higher than everything else, because it has more dirt on it. And finally, with that and a lot of watering right after we put on the seed, then it took, and it grew in. And it was such a pain to do it that I don't want to let it die. So I water it when I need to, so it doesn't all die completely off, and I have to do it all over again, because that would be a real pain. So that's why I have a sprinkler out here. Now it's just for show now. It's just it's a demonstration thing, because it's unhooked. I've had it unhooked for basically this whole month, because it's October. All this grass is going to go brown soon anyway. So septic field or not, it's fine. That's the natural cycle. So yeah. So it's just out here for demonstration purposes, just for this video. I can actually put it away now. It'd be great. But so we can't have sprinklers. And funny thing about that frozen ground stuff and how it affects the surfaces of the roads here is that it ties back into the idea that there was a point in time when the suburbs had their water mains but didn't have their sewer system. And I could tell this, learn this for the first time in California. You see, our roads on our street where we lived for most of the time that we lived there were put in with the subdivision when it was built in the early 50s. It was built around 1952, based on the stamps in the sidewalks and the tags on the original toilets that were in there when we moved in the early 80s, 30 years later. Something else that was there 30 years later, was most of the road, but it had the scars in it for when they put in afterward the sewer line and the extension of the wastewater lines for every house. There was a little rectangular patch in front of every house where the wastewater line had been extended to go into the sewer system. But before that, they had been on septic tanks. I don't know if they would have ever had septic fields, probably not. They likely only had the tanks for 5 to maybe 10 years. So it was likely that those scars had been there already in the road for 20 to 25 years by the time we moved in. And they were still there when we got there. They were still there when we left. They're probably still there today. They likely have not resurfaced that road in the 20 years since I've been there. it, it will probably eventually have to be resurfaced, but it just doesn't heave up like we do here. But so that actually shows back to the suburban roots of septic systems. Another suburban root of septic systems that you can talk about is a writer named Irma Bombeck. Probably a lot of younger people have no idea who she is. She was a newspaper columnist, humorist, and writer of books in the late 20th century, from the mid-60s until really her death in the early 2000s. She had been a newspaper reporter before that, when she first got out of college and first was married, but then her husband and her settled in the suburbs in Dayton, Ohio, a new suburb that was built there, and she raised her family. And, for several years, from about 58 to about 65, until they got old enough that they were going off to school every day, so she had free time, so she started writing a newspaper column. You don't have to go into the newsroom to do that. You can do it from home, and you can send it in by mail or courier or carrier pigeon or whatever the heck she used. It's something. But, yeah, she wrote about then what she knew, which was life in the suburbs. And this was in the mid-60s, when a lot of people from, beginning in the late 40s, really, had been moving to the suburbs. So she had a big audience for this. And she became very popular. She became syndicated in a bunch of newspapers, like hundreds of newspapers across the country. And that led to her getting book deals. And she started writing books in the 70s. And one of those books, in 78, was called The Grass is Always Greener Over the Septic Tank. It's musings about life in the suburbs. Just another example of how they had septic tanks in the suburbs for a while before they got hooked up to the sewer system. All that rapid growth of those things, it took them a while to get those sewer systems in. Now, what's that? Oh right, it's that pin from earlier. Talking about how the house was built up so high. So, to drain water, you need fall. And it's a certain amount of drop in elevation for every foot of pipe that you have to make it sure that the water is going to run downhill, like it does. So, you have to have that. If you don't have that, there is an option, and it's an electric pump to pump your sewage out of your house. And as my Uncle Jack said at the time, you don't want to have to pump your poop when we were building this. And we took his advice, so we built it up high. Now, we didn't want to have to build it up this high. We didn't want to build it right exactly where it is, because it's actually very close to the corner of the property. I have an irregularly shaped property that'll be part of a video coming up eventually about just the various properties around here and what our yards and things are like. But it's like 20 to 25 feet from the house to one of the corners of the property. We would have liked to have had it over a little farther that way, which is north, but you wouldn't know that. And a little lower. But the inspectors, when we were setting up this property, said your septic capture field has to be here. And it was already kind of high and far over, so we built it up and built the house over here. Because, you don't get what you want all the time, especially when there's inspectors involved. They say what you're going to do, and you do it. So, that's why the house is so high, and that's why it's over here. By the way, I borrowed that little pin in the finger bit from a YouTuber named Jenny Nicholson. She's very, very good. You should check her out if you like things like Disney films, Marvel films, Star Wars films, a lot of just various big pop culture things. She has really good takes on them. She's very astute. She's very funny, very insightful. She'll give you a new perspective on a lot of these things. She's pretty good. She doesn't do as many anymore. She used to do a lot of shorter ones about a single movie. Now she does a couple times a year. She'll do a big one, like an hour and a half, 2 hours long, about like a huge topic, like all the Land Before Time movies. And there's a lot of those, so it took her a long time to get through it. And she did it. She's done others since then too, and they're all longer form now. So, but you could always go back and watch her older ones if you want, just shorter forms, just to get a taste of what she's like. She's good. I think I'm going to do this from now on. I'm going to, make references to certain YouTubers that I like every so often, and try and expose them to whoever watches my videos, because, what else? What else is this for? Just support other people that you like on the platform, right? So I'm going to. And yeah, Jenny's one of them. She'll be the first. I'm sure she's thrilled. He doesn't know me from Adam. She's very good, and I'm a big fan, so there you go. But yeah, she was the inspiration for that little bit. It's a clever bit. I liked it, so I used it. And yeah, so that's why we built the house up so high. Now, back to the other pop culture person that I mentioned, from pop culture from my parents and their parents' generation, Irma Bombeck. My generation didn't read newspapers that much. Generations after me read them even less. It's, newspaper columnist is a dying art form, so yeah. But it's a very clever title. The grass is always greener over the septic tank. It's the name of the book. And it's a play on the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. And it's clever, and she was definitely a good writer. She obviously touched something in a lot of people to be as successful as she was. But she happened to be wrong. That's the grass over the septic tank, and it is dead. There's no dirt on top of it. It's like much like the septic field. There's just very little dirt. It's just it doesn't have sand underneath it. It has a concrete or cement box. So it's pretty thin, so it dries out real quick, and the grass on it dies. Now, I don't water this part because I don't care. This part is surrounded by really lush grass. You can see it sort of, and that will spread back into there and fill that in. It's only about a 3x6 rectangle anyway, so I just don't care. It will come back as soon as there's enough water, and there will be. It'll fill right back in like it was never bare to begin with. As long as I don't knock all the dirt off, I suppose. Anyway, yeah, that's how it goes. So, clever writer, very successful. Wrong title. Clever title, but wrong. Factually incorrect. Maybe her septic tank was buried a lot deeper than mine is. I don't know. You would think not, because you have to get access to the lids. But yeah, still a good title. Who'd have thought you'd have learned about Irma Bombeck today? There you go. It's part of just this little bit of stuff that I basically overheard secondhand. My parents didn't even read her, but it's just such a part of late 20th century America. I grew up during that time, so just something that I came across. But yeah, that's basically all there is to say about septic systems. Now you know parts of them and kind of how they work, and there you have it. You've learned something if you didn't know about it already. I had to learn it. Now you do too. Anyway, this kind of ends the water trilogy. I talked about rain, source of the water. Talked about the well, how you get the water into your house to use it, because you need it. And I talked about the septic system, what you do with the water after it's gone. It's kind of my Lord of the Rings trilogy. I started out with it. There will probably be related water topics, especially about snow, because snow is a big part of our winter here. And there's a lot of different things, there's a lot of different ways to take snow, so I will probably have a few videos about that. I'll probably have like a snow trilogy as well. It'll be like my Hobbit trilogy to my Lord of the Rings trilogy. The follow-up. Cool. Anyway, so you have something to look forward to this winter. And, so, hey, anyway, I am glad that you all watched, and thankful for everybody who shows up and supports the place. As always, you can do all the stuff down below if you so desire. And I hope you all have the best possible day that you can have. And I will see you soon with another video. Take care.